Good evening. Welcome to the Menil Drawing Institute. My name is Mary Magsman. I'm the manager of public programs. And thank you all for braving this cold, wet weather tonight to come out for our talk, a conversation with artist Ronny Quevedo and Kelly Montana, Associate Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute. This program is part of our Artist Talk series, which is generously supported by the Cockrell Family Fund. It is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel at a later date. Please join us next Thursday. We have a program in the main building that's a conversation about film preservation, and that will also be followed by a film screening of Tacita Dean's film Kodak. Ronny Quevedo is a multidisciplinary artist born in Ecuador and raised in the Bronx, New York. He earned his BFA from Cooper Union and his MFA from the Yale School of Art. Notably, from 2012 to 2014, he was a core fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. His work has been exhibited widely, including the Whitney Museum of Art, American Art, the Denver Art Museum, the Albright Knox Gallery, the Queens Museum, and many others. Quevedo uses drawing, particularly schematic renderings, in his practice to explore the visual language of abstraction, cartography, cosmology, and sport across the Americas. This evening, we will be exploring his latest site-specific wall drawing, Cara a Cara, that was commissioned here at the Menil Drawing Institute. This 36-foot triptych examines the relationship between origin, transfer, and translation, which with each panel representing a different step in the artist's process. Guiding tonight's conversation is Kelly Montana, and they will be exploring Quevedo's process, inspirations, and the broader context of his artistic process. So please join me in welcoming Ronny Quevedo and Kelly Montana.
Thanks very much, Mary, and it's wonderful to see all of you tonight. Thanks very much to Ronny for coming back and celebrating this drawing with us. It opened in September, and we've all had more than enough time to fall in love with it just about 4 times over. So we're really happy to have you here and think more deeply about it. The conversation tonight will be walking through Ronny's practice, works that he's been making in the last 10 to 12 years, and aspects of these works that I think can help us unlock how he arrived at the work that is very much with us this evening.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Really great to be back in Houston. Had a wonderful time when I was here in 2012 through 2015. And
As a core fellow.
As a core fellow, yeah. And also as a resident at Project Warehouse, which was an amazing opportunity for me. I just want to say a few thank yous to some folks because this project would not have happened without them, and in no particular order. I have to write them down so that I don't forget anybody. Kent Dorn, Tony Rubio, Martha Minton, Dominic Clay, Patrick Yarrington, Alex Rosas, Vincent Croft, Jan Brandt, Russ Lane, Mary Magsman, Tony Martinez, Constance Champagne, Edward Cup, Rebecca, thank you so much. And I also want to give a big thank you to someone who's not here, but is in New York, who's a huge part of the project, my studio assistant, Rafaela Fontanelle, with whom this project would not have happened.
Thanks, Rafa.
Yeah, and she was crucial through so many of the studies that we did, the material studies and planning things out. This project would not have happened to her without her. And Kelly, thank you so much for the invitation. I was really flattered and honored to be invited to do a project at the Menil and come back to Houston in a really great way. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ronny. Well, it's kind of a nice segue to introduce why we thought you were perfect for this project. And it was because we really saw how important line is to your practice, and really how this all started is we just wanted to learn more from you about that, because the way that you use line to kind of think about schematics, diagrams, how we kind of make, imagine, and wonder our world into being. It all, in many ways, comes from drawings. It comes from those initial marks of us putting it all together. And so in moving to one of the first works that I'd like to talk about, which is this one, The History of Rules and Measures, you see this impetus, you see this sense of the diagrammatic, the notational. So I was hoping you could actually start us off by talking about this work and kind of your interest in how we measure and quantify our world to make sense of it and how that comes into being in your practice.
Yeah, it's really funny because every time I think about this drawing, every time I see the image, it's in the same place in the Glasgow School when I made it in 2012, in my mind. And I remember it was one of the first iterations of thinking about line and thinking about where this connection to diagrams really started from. And so I was thinking a lot about my dad's history as a referee for inter soccer leagues in New York City. And so to me, that was a really important kind of formative part of my upbringing in New York, where all of a sudden this public gymnasium became a site for working class people to play soccer. And I wanted to find a way to kind of commemorate that in my own practice as someone who's constructing new spaces or new possibilities. And while it's really connected to the line work within the diagram of the playing field, I always thought about them as schematics for larger sculptures. And so like while there was this connection to line as something that connected to boundaries, about movement within a particular space, I always envisioned it at a larger scale. So that was something that was always kind of interesting to me, that these diagrams provided. There was obviously the schematic that you would see here that explored a possibility in a larger world, in a real world, in a way.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah, so like these marks on the ground are sort of suggestions or dictations of how like bodies move and relate through space in a particular construct of a sport, but you were also seeing them as translated into effectively this community that you saw coming together, like this larger set of relations of how people interact and bounce off one another and play and compete and all of these things.
Yeah, and I got to see them. I was a young kid and got to see these spaces being reconsidered and reconfigured. So like the basketball, the diagram of the basketball court became a soccer court for indoor soccer. Right, and the locker rooms became locker rooms for men who had just gotten off their job and like they're coming together and putting on their uniform and they're going back outside to play like a 30-minute game. And I got to see a public school turn into like a community space. And so like this kind of got me thinking about what the gym, or at least the diagram, can be reconsidered. All of a sudden this all became negotiable. And so that's what I really kind of, the line does always present a boundary or a barrier potentially, or in this case, subscribe to rules. And I just found it really a place where I can explore, well, how can I build upon this? How can I even build out from this?
Certainly.
And so it became a language I was really excited about.
And I think you get that in this image and in this work in particular, because there's such a space for possibility here. Like nothing, like you're interested in the line as a barrier, as a boundary, but there's also this space here that it feels like this opportunity, this improvisation, this, to me, what struck me by this was that it just felt like a musical score. It felt like something that could be like played and done differently each time, which really reverberated for me, and just bringing this wonderful lens that you bring to things like sport, to even just seeing a gymnasium floor in a whole new way, like the beauty of all these lines layered on top of each other that speak to all these different communities and speak to all these multiplicity of rules and ways of interacting.
And I also like the way that it's a kind of tracing of these steps in a way of what has existed, and potentially paying homage to those spaces that, people have traversed or spaces that people are about to go to. While it started within sport, I really thought about it as this kind of like conflation of space, potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned when we first started talking about this that you always think of it in that spot at the Gloucester, and that's a little bit of a tip into when you look at the media description of this. So one, what's contact paper?
Yeah.
and why, and can you just talk about the importance of those specific kinds of materials in your practice?
Yeah, the thing for materials that I've choose, I've always been trying to conscious about what these materials kind of keep connecting to, what kind of histories, what kind of audiences they represent or they speak for. And so contact paper has been something I've always been kind of interested in as this kind of in between this material that represents wood, isn't wood, but it also showcases a kind of aspiration in a way. And so it's also very economical. I used to buy at the dollar store and then cut them up into strips. Screen printing, I would consider a very economical way of producing an image over and over again. I was collecting drywall and peeling off the paper from the drywall. So I was really thinking about the material kind of from the substrate to the final image. And so I try to keep, I was really interested in what each material alone would represent, and hopefully that would, embody a bigger, more layered history of who I'm trying to represent, who I want to speak to. A lot of work in the early stages is this kind of communication with thinking about my dad and thinking about our upbringing, him being working class, but also having this esteemed career as a professional soccer player, and then coming to New York and becoming a referee with another kind of very successful career, even though it was at an amateur level. So I kind of, there was this position that I felt where I wanted to continue, or at least commit to a constraint that didn't feel limiting, that maybe it was kind of a responsibility in a way to kind of stick within materials, and then it's up to me to transform them, So that's why there's so many very specific materials, at least for me. They have a lot of connection to upbringing or cost in many cases. The idea of transforming a material into an art object is really interesting to me. And that still goes to this day when I'm using muslin or thread or using pattern paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that it's like you're thinking about it site specific, but in some ways like the sites are multiple, like the way this contact paper or drywall and all these things that had specific places come into your practice and bring those histories with them, but not necessarily with a one-to-one correspondence. I also love that, contact paper for many people might not be legible, but for specific communities, as you're saying, it's like if you work with this material, you know exactly what it is. And you're coming in and you're seeing it on a wall, and how special that can be of this kind of shared language of materials that might happen really unexpectedly for someone.
And a shift and potentially a new association with that material.
Yeah. The next work I would like to speak to is Wifala and the paint. So first of all, what is a Wifala?
So Wifala is an emblem that is used in the Andes, and it's, I say emblem because it's not exactly a flag, even though nowadays it's used mostly within flag designs. And it's a grid made of 49 squares, so they're 7 by 7. That was used in the Andes before conquest to indicate different regions, but also different kind of lineages. The best association would be kind of a coat of arms, where in this case, a color or a sequence of colors would represent a region or a person. And so if you had one of these designed for you, obviously you were of high regard. And so that would be kind of your shield, your coat of arms in a way. More contemporarily, it's used, and this, you can probably make out the white squares creating this diagonal and some other colors around it. More contemporary, it's being used as a flag that represents indigenous communities in the Andes. So.
And they do have this. They typically have this kind of grid.
Yeah,
pattern.
it's a checkerboard, not checkerboard. It's a grid pattern. Yeah, 7 by 7, 49 squares in total. Yeah, and that the modularity of it not just represents in the Wafala, but also in the Chukana and what would be described as the Inca cross, but also in architecture. So what I found really interesting about it, it's not only its kind of heraldic kind of suggestion, but also that it's a visual pattern that I could play with, you know, and it helps in connecting it with the gym floor as another kind of grid that I was responding to.
Layering those two together. I mean, hearing you talk about Awifala, it's making me think about, I don't know, again, because how sport is so prominently referenced here, again, these like allegiances, these communities that come together. You know, there's a wide swaths of people that might not have any other interactions in any other space, but like sport, that is, you know, where they find each other. But it also makes me think about the grid as a kind of abstraction. And part of what excites me so much about your work is that you take very seriously a longer history of abstraction, and you look at the way it's been used for millennia in the Andes, and kind of bringing that visual language and kind of ensuring that it still has its enduring valor as an abstract visual language.
Yeah, it's funny because for this one, I was really I felt like it was really literal. Like what you just explained is kind of what I was doing here. I was like, I wanted to show this very kind of older way of communicating geography and community with the Wifala to something more contemporary like the Atlanta Hawks or the Sacramento Kings, which is also a type of heraldry that I grew up loving these things because that's kind of how I learned geography. Like if it wasn't for the World Cup and flags and all these things, I wouldn't know I wouldn't even know where a lot of these countries are. You know, so there's also this kind of like stepping up of the visual language that we all really kind of I don't know, it just feels like I feel there's more of an immediacy to visual culture. And sometimes I didn't want the connection that you pointed out, this kind of expanse or this wide lens to get overlooked. And so I just thought to really try to bring those two together and see if there's any visual cues or connections that could be kind of made a little clearer, more obvious to audience.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
So expanding on that, this is the next work I'd like to talk about, and this one is titled Revolutions Abound, Estadio Olímpico Atahualpa. And Atahualpa, from what I understand, was the last ruler of the Inca, of pre-conquest Inca. So it's a work that does this kind of aerial layering that you were talking about. So we see an Olympic stadium over this rhythm of kind of intersecting lines, but then the title also tips off that you're also looking at Andean history, Andean architecture.
Yeah.
So can you kind of expand on the relationship between those here?
Yeah, and so I start with the gym floor, and then I kept thinking about the different fields that I kept kind of growing up with, places that I'd never been to. So I never got to go to this stadium in Ecuador. And one thing that was really prominent in my upbringing is like the first time that Ecuador qualified for the World Cup was at this stadium. And it was huge. It's just like, I don't know, I'm sure some people here who watch soccer can like kind of imagine that feeling of your country qualifying for the World Cup. And it's like, I wanted to find a way to connect these moments in time. I also want to talk about the material. So this is also looking at pattern paper, or what I would consider, I call it oak tag. So that's the green paper that you see there, which is used to make patterns. And so
like clothes patterns.
Clothes patterns, sorry, yeah. I'm just assuming everybody knows what I'm talking about.
I did the work to learn all this, so you're all going to learn it too.
And it was in the kind of another economical choice in a way, but it was also starting to bring in my mom's history as a seamstress. So this oak tag you buy in rolls of 48 inches. I'm like, this is perfect. I can make a map these connections to this blueprint of this time and moment really would come up. And so the blue that you see here is also this wax paper that's used to create
I mean, you use
traces.
it, right? You trace it onto the fabric
Yeah.
to make, and you would use it to make like pleats and darts. So you would mark it out to like
Right.
make those kind of pinches
Yeah.
or folds.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
So I started connecting so many of these things to drawing and the way that I work, and also this sense of erasure and the economy of it, because more or less the material is pretty cheap, and so like experimentation, it can really abound. Like, pardon the pun, but like it was something I could kept doing it over and over again. But in terms of like what these lines were indicating, I was thinking cosmology, like what was happening further away from this moment in time, right? And so that's what some of these lines are indicating, stars moving above it. There are also lines that are indicating the gaze of these people within the stadium looking at the soccer game.
Oh, interesting.
And I also wanted to see how I can keep kind of adding to this connection to Nazca lines and thinking about earthworks and monumental works that are part of my lineage, that's part also of this kind of expanding of our history. Because when I was kind of coming across these at an earlier age, they were often contextualized within archaeology, you know, and studies of ancient societies, you know, and so that didn't kind of make sense to me. And so there's this kind of
we still draw lines in the stars.
Yeah.
So it's not a bygone practice.
yeah, so that's also something that keeps as a kind of as a through line in a way of like making sure that there's still a connection to these works that sometimes are marginalized as like, you know, we don't know what they are. They're not art, but they're archaeology. They're kind of in the right in between potentially. Yeah.
I mean, you talking about the different senses of perspective in this, I find really fascinating, because in some ways it's like an architectural study of like who can see what in this space. What's the experience of you, someone going there? But then like the Nazca lines, there's this kind of aerial view of this work. And I mean, the scale of it is huge. I mean, when you talk about it being on oak tag paper, and which is a substrate used to cut fabric, it means it's like the size of us. Like this is,
Right.
you know, it's always surprising when you see something that's like to your scale, and you're
Yeah,
like, right,
yeah.
this is very immersive and very big. But also thinking about its relationship of this aerial view to something like the Nazca lines, where, you know, the understanding of these works is that you could have many different experiences of them, but the total ultimate view of them would have been for the divine, right? Or
and completely
absolutely
unavailable to us.
Completely,
right?
yeah. Like the scale of these they're miles. They're you know,
Right.
they're on the sides of mountains and hills. You
Yeah.
can see them if you're on top of a mountain, but to get a
Yeah.
sense of what they are and their relationships to each other, it's like you're mapping. They're like mapping the stars, or they're mapping their understanding of natural features onto the earth at a scale that's incomprehensible.
Yeah, and what I've always appreciated, it's like a kind of offering in a way, right? Because you're presenting all this labor, you're producing all this labor to something you won't be able to see potentially. And you know, the ones that are more popular are the ones you're showing here, where we can kind of see that's like a bird, or it's a spider, or something that we kind of recognize. There's a huge number of them that are just lines,
Right.
mapping constellations, you know. And so I also find that fascinating. It's almost the abstraction of the field in a way was accepted as being abstract, but also that it was connected to something very concrete that we don't understand. And so that in a way kind of was really it provides a kind of a ground to create these works in a very abstract way, you know.
Yeah. We're going to move on to a brief lesson in another type of Andean art making, which is the quipu. And
I feel like I'm doing a book report.
But And I'm just going to show this briefly, but I guess the connection that I want to make to it, to what we've been talking about, is that this is also a way of like tracking time and tracking history and tracking space, much in the way of like the constant, like not dissimilar from like tracking stars to understand time and understand your place and relationship in history and in this community and in this kind of worldview that you're part of. But this is a type of object and a form that you've used in your work.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear you talk about this quipu motif in here, particularly how it manifests, and then also speak a little bit more to pattern paper and the relationship between the two.
Yeah, the quipu, I mean, as an object to me has always been really fascinating because it's one of those artifacts that is fully intact, and there's hundreds of them, if not thousands. Some of which have been decoded and some of which we don't know what they represented. And one thing that always strikes me about these artifacts that from a visual perspective, they're amazing and super interesting to consider. Contextually, there isn't anything available. And so
it's just knots.
It's just
knots
there. And
knots and
the
thread.
context isn't available. And in a way, the kind of the violence, the oppression, the conditions of which these things came to be kind of hovers over them, at least to me. And so it's also really strange kind of moment where like it's concrete, it's right, like I can physically touch it, and yet I have no access to it. And it represents my lineage. You know, so there's something kind of deeper within it. And when I thought about this object, I kept thinking about counting, kept thinking about something as common as thinking what a sequence, right? And I was thinking about my dad's history as a soccer player and also as a referee. And one thing that I was always really fascinated by, which he took great pride in being an arbiter. You know, in Spanish you would say arbitro, which I always found more poetic. You know, he's the judger of when things start and when things end. He's the judger of, he judges when time starts and when you turn it off, what's fair and what's foul. And so I made a quipu for him on a sheet of pattern paper for his shirt, which again, so there's this interaction between my mom's career and my dad's career and placing those things together. And so this is, I wouldn't say, it might be an early work. I think 2016 is when I started. 2018 is probably still early. But there's gold leaf behind the pattern paper, and then that pattern paper is applied to muslin. And so the lines that you see here, the 45 indicators of the 45 minutes of a half, are made with that blue wax paper. So I was try to be as direct as possible with the material that I'm using and making sure it stayed within the realm of my mom's hand or my dad's career in some way. And so, again, the substrate, thinking about substrate has been something I've been really kind of tough on myself about, making sure that it's always calling back to some history or something that I want to represent. And so muslin has been a very conscious choice in that way.
And especially of the relationship of you using something like gold and something like pattern paper, putting it together. Again, that sense of like elevation, revalorization, like it's always sort of been there, but calling attention to it and giving it like a new life, as you were saying, and a new context.
Yeah, and not just in this case, in some of the other cases of using the gold pattern, I was also coming across these moments where like the gold was being displayed of maybe it'd be an earring and a nose ring and a mouthpiece without any context of the person that wore it, you know? But they were very consciously put up in that area where it would be.
Right.
And so I kind of thought about that for when I wanted to incorporate it into these other kind of fragmented bodies that would be laid out in a garment design.
Yeah, I mean, no, those are really beautiful and fascinating connections between this kind of chasm you feel, this gulf you feel between you and a quipu, and going and seeing these objects in a museum setting where the figure is there and not there. And I think actually for me, a really wonderful and helpful through line in your work is kind of thinking about like, how is the body imaged here? Because in some ways it kind of always is. Like you're always thinking about, there is a way in which a body is imaged here, or you're thinking about how one kind of imagines or makes their world or makes their world knowable to them through globes or mapping so I found it to be a helpful way to understand your work of like where is the body?
Where is the body? Yeah. It's the figurative works, in my opinion.
And we'll just touch kind of briefly on this. I'm keeping track of time, don't worry. But yeah, I guess maybe just to talk briefly about this one, again, that sense of, you've talked about kind of boundaries and borders. You've talked about kind of geography and one's position and relationship to the globe. So can you expand on that in speaking to this work?
Yeah, this is a series called Every Measure of Zero. That was a long-standing series on small sheets of paper where I was using a lot of the wax paper and coming up with the process that you kind of see here, where it was like one impression was pressed into paper, and then that was transferred by the wax paper itself onto another sheet of wax paper or onto another substrate, and it provided a series of multiples that I could work from. And this kind of started because I didn't...
Here's the wax paper.
Yeah. There was moments
this one
where...
happens to be yellow, but it's wax on this side, and it's just, so this is what you're working on.
Yeah. So similar to carbon paper, where it's like the image is recorded and transferred at the same time, right? And so I always found that when I came across it in a way, I was like, oh, I can make like 3 drawings out of the same work in a way. But it conceptually, it also reconnected me to this idea of like information that's being transferred over and over, and mistranslation or translations, and ideas that we kind of keep generating without question. And so one of the things I kind of was a little bit wanting to understand was the sense of the globe and this kind of notion that the mapping and the drawing of the globe is neutral. We consider it as this kind of neutral design. And that isn't always necessarily the case, that it's a fair reading of geography. It also spoke a little bit of the boundaries that we place on countries, or this idea of north and south, depending on where you kind of are standing. And so there was moments where I kind of give myself this perspective of just the sphere as a globe, but also a wider perspective of like, light years away from space. And so in this case, I was questioning the grid that we place on this circular shape and what that represents, and how I can kind of manipulate it or reconsider what it all indicates. And it became this questioning of all this type of mapping.
Yeah. No, I hadn't realized that connection between what the transfer paper does, because using it again and again, there's information lost, but what's also generated in that, and thinking about that as a mode of translation, also as a mode of inheritance, right? These ideas that we inherit the idea of this image of the globe as neutral, but in fact it was made and forced. It was, right? And so then what do we gain and what do we lose from that chasm or that gulf in between there?
Yeah, so this is, I'm stepping further and further away from Earth in a way. And there's a constellation, Lyra, that I've dedicated to my dad, and kind of a specific map that I use often of those stars to indicate him and continue to pay homage. And
we'll talk briefly about this, just because it's, you spend a lot of time with us here at the Menil, and I think there's ways in which this place, this collection, imbued what we have in front of us. But we spend a lot of time actually talking about this particular drawing that we both are totally in love with. And it's it's a piece of paper, but it has this kind of aperture in the middle where these different colors are kind of iterated across that aperture. And it has this almost like felt-like sort of texture to it. It's just so thick and built up. So I would just love to hear your kind of current thoughts on this and how Whitten kind of figures in your practice.
I'm a huge Jack Whitten fan. I was lucky enough to meet him when I was in high school and got to visit his studio and was just incredibly impressed with the work ethic, the kind of seriousness with which he took his work, but also kind of diligence that I saw. And there was something that he said that has always stuck with me, because it was a group of high school students. We were all about to embark on art school, and I was about to embark on Cooper. And he was like, just tell you guys, the reason I became a carpenter is because in case this painting shit doesn't work out, and like that really stuck with me. Because coming from a working class upbringing, you kind of need some kind of applicable skill in case this painting shit doesn't work out. And so that was something that really stuck with me. And in seeing the way that he was just really prolific and just constantly moving and studying and questioning material, it's just something that stuck with me. And when we got to see some of this piece in particular that's in the collection, I think, I can't remember exactly, but what we realized is that within that aperture, he used it as a stencil to create the piece. So there's this gradation within the work, and it's like this really small, subtle transition and shift, and it really spoke to me because it spoke about his connection to photography, the idea of the camera being crucial to painting. It spoke about of transferring information, and the idea of a line kind of degrading a little bit, and so optics is a big part of this work, and I really appreciated seeing it in person, kind of having this aha moment. It's like, oh, I saw what you did. And that's what I've always really liked about Jack Whitten's work. There's this kind of investigation of not just the material, but like, what is the concept that I'm trying to convey? And it's through the material. I don't know how to explain it, but it's this kind of like devotion to plasticity. And that's what I've always really appreciated about his work. And I try to kind of commit to that as well, and thinking about how can I continue to take this pattern paper and turn it into something else, or reconsider it and reconfigure it to kind of speak on to further other things. Yeah.
I mean, when I also think about Whitten in terms of your work, you talked about how important photography is to him, and he would talk about how he wanted to be like a camera in his art practice, and that he wanted to kind of make a composition or a mark in a single gesture, just like the way a camera would click.
Economical.
Yeah, and that his thinking behind that was, well, yeah, everything I am and all my experiences are of course going to come across in that. And so it can be about all of these things without them being imaged. And I think about that so much of your work, because you're so generous always in sharing your backstory, but in some ways it's like it's all going to be there no matter what you make. It's all there anyways. And so it can operate in all these different levels, and you can take all these kind of lenses to it. You sharing biography is helpful, but there's all these other things happening too that it imbues, but you don't necessarily need to have, I don't think.
And there was something, when I was reading his notes, he wrote about this notion of composite perspective that really stuck with me. And we talked about it a little bit, of like, there is a possibility of having all these perspectives come into play. It requires a lot of work as an artist to really pull that together. And when you read those notes, you kind of see him not struggling necessarily, but like demanding a little bit more of what he's about to do with the painting, or what he's going to do with the drawing, or whatever it might be. And so it's always been really interesting. So
now I am going to fast forward.
Okay,
so you'll have
go
to,
for it.
Okay. So I'll drift a little slowly on these. because I think there's a lot here for us to chew on as we think about.
That's the first full-scale piece.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something maybe just people can see.
Yeah, absolutely. So working, again, that like thinking about that really thinking about like people in space, like how that initial drawing of that first one we showed tonight, you always wanted to turn it into sculpture, and like here it is, like here it is, and you had people come, and people did come and play on this. Like this isn't like a stage photograph, like
I would go every 2 or 3 weeks and do a drawing in chalk, and then people would come in and disperse it. It was great.
This one I love as well. Here's this work that's at LaGuardia Airport. Us Houstonians don't get to see it very often because we tend to not fly Delta, but but it's there and you can go find it.
Yeah.
But again, this like, I think for us also, like we saw this and it was like, oh, he's got this. Like like it's a big wall. It's moving from, this patterned paper that's at certain size, but like the sense of scale was always there. I mean, even though some of the works we've looked at are tiny, as you said, they're 8 inches by 11 inches. Like looking at them on the screen, you would imagine it's this here. So there was always this sense of monumentality, I think, in your work, because you're always thinking about that relationship between like the micro and the macro. There was always this sense that it could kind of go bigger.
Yeah.
But I want to ensure that we spend some time talking about cara a cara. So I'll just keep the screen on this one just so we all can kind of see a detailed image together, but obviously we're talking about this work that's right next to us. So I guess I would want to start in thinking about just what was the initial kind of spark for this idea, what really unlocked the composition for you, and then talking about how it's made.
Yeah, I was nervous and didn't know what to do, and it was an invitation to the Drawing Institute, of which I was like, I draw like this. It's what I want to be known for. Like I do drawing, but it's part of my practice. And so, whenever I thought about drawing in terms of like my series, I kept thinking of Every Measure of Zero and the works that connected to wax paper, and I was a little intimidated, but I was like, this is the way to go. I need to scale this up. It's going to be tricky, but I think this is what is going to kind of respond well to the space. It's going to respond well to the context, and it's going to show tracing. It's going to show mistakes. It's going to show organic aspect of the making of the thing. And so what I decided to do is kind of parse it into its 3 kind of stages of the white section being a kind of embossment. So if this was paper, I would be kind of digging into the paper and creating an embossed groove. And then the second panel represents that heat transfer moment where I'm using an iron to transfer the wax onto the surface, in this case, the wall. And then the third section is the wax paper itself, which is kind of the trickiest thing to figure out, because the sheets themselves are only 28 by 36, something like that.
So really that last panel is just a massive grid of this
sheets,
paper here that you're looking at. That's just wallpaper to the surface. And that's the paper that was used. The wax was heated off of it and melted into the wall for the second one. And then in the first one, the wax was by tracing on the back, that drawing of that transfer to the surface. So you're looking at all those, again, what we've been talking about this evening, of this sense of like what's lost, what's gained, what's generated, what's translated, what's mirrored, inverted, subverted, and again, to kind of connect to these larger ideas of inheritance, really, and what happens to communities as they move and spread across the globe away from places and to other places. So it's all kind of in there, just in this process.
Yeah, and the mapping that I wanted to start with was kind of scaling up the pattern paper, the dress patterns to a scale that might be recognizable, but also would never be fitting anybody, right? And so there's imagery there of like a chest, a piece of a jacket. Other parts are like a sleeve or a cuff. along with 2 scale drawings of a soccer field, basketball court, 2 scale onto the drawing, and there's this kind of play with what is one-to-one and what is at a distance. And I wanted to continue this connection to being a seamstress, being a person that runs within a field and what it means to play, and have them kind of be the main points of interaction within the work. And so like there's decisions of connecting one thing to the other, kind of games that I would play with myself. I was like, okay, I'm not going to touch that line, or there's a certain degree that I wouldn't go beyond. These are just kind of internal things that I was doing. And then when I was on site, I would only use the curvature of a 30-foot diameter, you know. So all these kinds of things that kind of kept pulling back to the original reference. And then the title came thinking about this idea of putting things to each other, face to face.
And then, and face, for those who don't know, is the visible side of fabric. It's called the face of the fabric. So that's always what you look at when you're cutting the paper. And so some of these patterns will sometimes say, when you cut this out, you need to put this face to face when you sew it. So
and it's always like face A to face B. Sometimes there's face C, and in Spanish it would be cara A to cara B. And I really wanted to continue to play with that idea of like, where's the original? How is it becoming an original? This connection to like self-development potentially. You know, there's, I mean, the psychology of it, it's like, it's very much thinking about what you were saying, this inheritance, right? What is the inheritance here? What is being lost? What's being gained? Or what's being transformed potentially? And I want the imagery to keep going back to a specific history. And in this case, you know, it's thinking about my parents, but also thinking about how that history can articulate a kind of more expansive view of movement in you know, this geography. And so, you know, there's moments that are very clear, it's like what it represents, and there's moments where it's, you know, abstracted or even subdued, you know. So and I was also thinking about the idea of moving through the piece, from one place to the other, that you'll recognize some things reoccurring. So the cara a cara was really thinking about this idea of being face to face with a past, being face to face with material, you know, and how that kind of transforms and becomes something else, and kind of playing with that a little bit, you know,
The last detail I want to mention before we open it up to questions, because it was so thoughtful on your part, and it gets so overlooked, but it makes such an enormous impact, is that as you look around this room, you'll notice that the wall where it meets the floor in here, there's something called a reveal. So it's like a gap. And you specifically did not want a gap on this wall. So this drawing goes all the way down to the floor. And that's something we did particular for you. And you were really, that was like...
that was adamant.
It
was a deal breaker.
Yeah, we had to do it. And because, and the impact is enormous. It gives it, I mean, so I would love to hear what you knew about that detail as one of the first things you knew had to happen in this drawing.
I wanted it to be part of the architecture. I did not want it to kind of just sit on there. And so in order to make it feel like it was part of the architecture, it needed to go to the ground. It has this kind of like feeling of a scroll, but it also, there's no question of like, the top and the bottom is the material. And I think if you create a window for the object, you're looking into it. I want people to be immersed in it. And so like that was one of the reasons I wanted to get rid of the reveal and make it feel like there's no kind of question as to why this thing is here or what it's doing.
Yeah, there's like solidity to it. And it also has this kind of stele-like effect. It just has like this, right, the way it just sits, right? It's the effect has been really, I think, really important for this work. So I'm glad we heard you. So with that, I think we're going to open up to a few moments for questions. So we have a microphone coming around. So please go ahead and raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for that talk. It's fantastic. Hi, Ronny.
Hi, Allison.
There's such a lyricism to your line and a movement and a dynamism. I wonder if you could talk about your relationship to music.
That lyricism, I think it's coming. I kind of think about like movement on the floor. Like if you think about the squeaking of basketball players, which is something that happened a lot when there was indoor soccer being played. And so I kind of think about the movements on the page or the wall in that way, that they are these abrupt kind of, I wouldn't say noises, because the squeak can be quite beautiful on its own. And so there's moments where I think about them as squeaks, but there's also moments where I think about the sound of chalk being applied to grass. And those are the kind of things I kind of think about, like what kind of response do I want to represent in that line. And yeah, I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question. Yeah.
Anyone else? We've got one up front here, Tony.
Thank you for the talk.
How's it going?
Ronny, I was wondering if you could, I was very struck by the work we weren't able to talk about too much in LaGuardia, particularly its title, Pacha, Cosmopolitanism, Overtime. Very rich. And it seems to me it has to do with public commissions, and it says something about labor, it says something about overtime, which is the continuation of the game, cosmopolitanism, which is about the airport, and the idea that you're now moving between spaces, not only the diasporic spaces, but now art world spaces. And if you could say something about how that might apply to Cara a Cara.
Yeah, the title is another space to give context, and that's something I've always tried to be very mindful of, is like, how can the title provide context, especially when working in a, very abstract space. And so what you pointed out about labor, which in cosmopolitanism and overtime is very much on point. When I was thinking about Cara a Cara, I was very specific with Kelly about how it's going to be spelled out and reproduced, that there's a space between each letter so that it functions as a kind of diagram on its own and a map, that it gives you time. It hopefully makes you question what's being said, and there's also this kind of as it relates to the imagery, thinking about the manual labor that goes into garment making. My mom was a part of the garment industry, and there's a lot of labor that's very invisible within that. And so, in hopes of like bringing that to the surface, I try to slow it down a little bit, even with just the idea of like putting space between a letter. And so, I do want these lines to represent textiles. I want it to represent labor, and I'm thinking about that also within I'm going to kind of go on a tangent here, but like the digital labor of textile in pre-Columbian times in the Andes, because these are women making these textiles that contributed to the geometric abstraction that this land and geography is known for. And so in continuing to use those dress pattern designs, I'm hopefully making that connection as well. And so that's something I do think about a lot. Yeah. Hope that answers a little bit.
The Pacha is the indigenous knowledge.
Yeah. And when I can incorporate a term that's as expansive as the kind of lens that I'm thinking about, that's always like a really big plus for me, because it's like, okay, there's language available to represent the concept that I'm really thinking about. Because sometimes, language can fail me. Yeah.
Ronny, I was curious how your relationship to drawing changes when you're working on a work of this scale, or a work like we saw at LaGuardia. Mm-hmm. The images of the discrete works that we saw on the screen, to me, seem like there's a real intuitive sense that you're approaching drawing through making. But whenever you're dealing with an institution or something that's incredibly large scale, does drawing as a kind of like preparatory method come into play in a way that it doesn't necessarily like in your day-to-day studio practice?
Yeah, I've always appreciated the notion that it's a preparatory operation that allows for iteration to be considered something as serious as the final piece, And when it comes to like the LaGuardia piece, like Kelly was saying, I was kind of ready for that one 10 years ago. Like I was planning all those drawings as if they were going to be schematic. When it comes to scaling up, I think I just had to give myself some rules. And so kind of committing to saying every arc will be using the 30-foot diameter or the 6-foot diameter, those kinds of things that I felt I could scale up as kind of a parameter to work within, that never feels limiting, That to me feels like a container in which to operate and even make it expansive, kind of like looking, it's kind of an explosion in a can or something, like it's something I've always appreciated about drawing, that like you can place limits on yourself in a way in order to make iteration the purpose and hopefully kind of create something new and different. Yeah.
And then, given the appearance of certain surface qualities, then there's a lot of stuff that's just happening in the space through the act of making as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's some things that came about kind of really late in the game. So there's gold leaf flakes throughout the piece that are very, very subtle. And the object used to make it was this object that you would put chalk into when creating a pattern on paper, on fabric. And so it was a drawing.
That was just freehand drawing. That was just you.
Yeah, it was freehand drawing, just testing out. I was like, does gold dust fit in this thing? And does it work? And it does. And it just keeps like, it's nice. Again, it's like kind of sifting through the fabric store to see what is a drawing tool there. Has always been a really fun thing to do. Yeah.
Ronny, one of the things about your work is that you're like looking at systems, you're looking at systems that require agreements, like games and sports, assumptions about our bodies and the patterns and how those garments protect us. As we've been spending time with your work, with the public, a lot of what comes up with the kind of diagrams, the notations, the formations, and around sports and movement really sit in well for issues around migration, forced, enforced, ported, deported, all of these terms which are so chaotic right now, and where rules and systems are being completely ripped apart in terms of how people move across so-called borders. So I wondered if you could bring that experience as an immigrant, as coming from a family of immigrants, and what that means today in 2025, and how your work gives us a window, a mirror, a guidepost, a map towards the kind of freedom that you were enjoying with your drawing practice.
Yeah, I think what the diagram provides is the sense of planning, the sense of movement, and the sense of possibility. And one thing that I've wanted to kind of maybe make a case for is that these mappings existed before and during, and that there is this lineage of thinking about a future, of thinking about a possibility in which multiple things are considered in order to create a geography, so that these bounds that we prescribe and apply onto spaces are self-generated, and that possibility of shifting them and changing them are as malleable as the first time we decided to, dedicate a boundary. And I also have been kind of more conscious of thinking about my parents' history as a model for making the work. And I think this is something, it's not new, it's just something that, how do I kind of explain it? Like, I do feel more emboldened to use it as a way to make work and not necessarily have to talk about them entirely. And that those mappings that they created are very similar mappings to other people going through that experience of like, how do you make sense of a new space in which potentially you're welcomed and unwelcomed simultaneously? And that allows for like abstraction and this sense of navigating and figuring things out as a safe place to operate from. Not to say it's not being threatened, but that this kind of figuring out is available and something that we can use as a place in which we move, but we don't have to stay there. Not sure if that kind of makes sense, but I do want these kind of mappings to present a conflation of past and potential future. And so I'm gonna go on a tangent again. Like this conversation kind of came up in the recent retreat with other artists, and we were talking about the politics of what's about to come. And I'm like, but we've been living in the future for a long time. Like there are people, like some of the artists that I work with and I talk to, that I confide in, we've been thinking about a different kind of future for a very long time. And trying to not let this kind of impending doom threaten that is crucial. So there's two fronts. It's like being able to speak upon what these parallels of different diasporas has taught us and allowing that to be kind of a way to operate in this next thing that we want to consider as culture, but also learning from how those things have operated in the past and trying to find methods and ways of moving within threats that are about to come. But not forgetting that there's still kind of like a sense of possibility that is necessary. Like the imagination of a different space is completely necessary, just as much as fighting what's about to come is also necessary. I went on a long tangent there, so I think I might just stop.
We have time maybe for one more question. Thank you. I came from LaGuardia a few days ago, so this is my first time with your work, and I really appreciate being here. Given the prevalence of sports as a theme, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the concept of play, and if and how that comes up, very specifically as what its role is in social and communal relationships, the play part of sport.
Yeah. I mean, the way I kind of grew up with play. My dad watched soccer adamantly. He was a referee. He was a soccer player. Like, play was very much part of our lives and was taken very seriously. But I also came across it as a place to create communal space. So these indoor soccer leagues and these amateur leagues were created by migrant communities so that they can kind of continue a kind of tradition of play. Right? And, this is why some of the work thinks about Mesoamerica. Is like, there's architecture always been devoted to play. And there's a history of play as being something serious, something that we have to consider culturally relevant constantly, and not just for the competitive nature, for the reason to kind of convene and think about what play can represent, whether it be kind of a metaphor for good and bad, dark and light, or a solo act, right? There's also competitions where it's about just like the individual performing at their highest peak, So, it's very much about play, and kind of I have a lot of fun with the rules that I establish for myself when I'm making drawings, but also thinking about the history of play is something that's really relevant to cultural development and in many cases for the drawings and architecture. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go ahead and end on that note. Thank you, Ronny.
Thank you, Kelly.
So much.
Thank you all for coming.